Today, we are talking about Story by Robert Mckee. This is a craft book. It's about the substance, structure, style, and principles of screenwriting. If all you're wondering is, should I read this book? Is it for me? I have a video about that. I will link it here. You should go watch that. This video is going to be longer. This video is going to be in depth because my goal with this video is to go through Story by Robert Mckee, chapter by chapter, talk about what is in the chapter, like the contents, comment on it, share a couple of insights, and I'm gonna rate each chapter on how useful it was to me. The rating and the things that I liked, that is incredibly biased. That is just my opinion. And you will find things helpful for you that I didn't find helpful and vice versa, but this is just my experience with it. I'm saying that to say this. It's like pouring rain outside and I don't know if you can hear me. I'm gonna have to check the audio on this. All that being said, I am not a screenwriter. This book is clearly for screenwriters. I am approaching it as an author, a writer, screenwriters are writers, a novelist. I'm approaching it as a novelist, seeing what value it has for me. I've read all sorts of screenwriting books. Arguably, Save the Cat is a screenwriting book, unless you read Save the Cat Writes a Novel. Anatomy of Story is a screenwriting book. They all have principles and things we can learn from. We are gonna start with the introduction. Oh yes, we are being so thorough in this video. Chapter by chapter, here we go. The introduction is basically philosophizing about what is story and what is a good story. And he has some really lovely quotes in here that I'm just gonna share with you. I love this one. He says that we do not wish to escape life, but find life through stories. To use our minds to flex our emotions, to enjoy, to learn, and to add depth to our days. Another thing he says that I really appreciate, he says that rather than, agonizing over the odds of will you become a screenwriter, will your movie get done, he says, put your energies into achieving excellence. I also think that's good advice. In this chapter, he talks about how originality is equal to content plus form, which reminded me a little bit of Anatomy of Story and the designing principle and premise that John Truby presents. You could argue that content is the premise and form is the designing principle, although if you go over to the comment section of that video, I have had so many people describe what the designing principle is to me in such good detail. These are such good comments. You should go read them if you've ever wondered what the designing principle is, because they do a great job. He talks a little bit, he continues to kind of talk about just like story, the heart of story. So that chapter is just very inspiring. There is lots of just good wisdom in there, good ruminations, good philosophizing. And so, I never said this. I'm gonna be rating the chapters on a scale of 1 to 3. Why? Because I'm an engineer and I hate false precision. We're not doing false precision. 1 is bad, not helpful. It's not bad. 1 is not very helpful to me. 3 is incredibly helpful to me, and 2 is like kind of in the middle. Easy enough scale. 1, 2, 3. I rate this chapter a 2, only because I really appreciated everything it had to say. Doesn't have any necessarily like practical advice that's gonna change how I write my stories forever, but I found it very inspiring and good to read. Chapter 1, which I did not write the title of, Chapter 1 is called The Story Problem. And oh my goodness, the first word I wrote on here, I don't know if you can see this, controversial. So basically, he starts off talking about how and why stories made now, and remember this was written in the 90s, why they suck. And I have to say, like, there's some things were better in my day vibes to this, but I do kind of see it. Are there still good stories being written? Yeah, I think so. Are they as good as Casablanca? I don't know, I've never seen Casablanca, so I can't compare. Anyways, he does continue talking about stories and why we write them and why they're still important. Here's a quote that I loved. As our faith in traditional ideologies diminishes, we turn to the source we still believe in, the art of story. And I love that. I mean, what a good insight, right? Like, people are moving from religion, but where are they moving to? They're moving to Netflix and Disney Plus and Amazon Prime. And, you know, the baby boomer in you is like, ugh, this is horrible. Why is that happening? But is it really all that bad to find meaning in stories? No, I don't think so. Very interesting. We're going to what's good about this. I agree with a lot of what he said. I think, yeah, movies used to be better in some cases. If you've seen Blockers, you get that concept. He mentions one thing that I thought was really interesting and why stories have declined. He says characters are never revealed to be more than they seem. And later on in the book, he'll talk about how having dimensions to characters is incredibly important. And I was thinking about that and I was like, yeah, I was more thinking honestly about like the Disney Channel shows that I used to watch as a kid and how like all the characters did exactly what they seemed, were exactly who they seemed, and they never surprised you and they just were their character. And how that's kind of boring and it's cool to see beneath the layers of someone. Anyways, from that like slow start, he really turns it around. Page 21 gets extremely motivating and aspirational. He recalls the power of story and how important it is. I drew a happy smiley face here. And then he talks about the two ways that stories can be bad. Again, I think this is great. Number one is, he calls it slice of life, so nothing happens. Number two is overstretched or overcomplicated, where tons of things happen, but it has no meaning. I think that was a good thing to point out because a lot of writers, like new writers, amateur writers like me, we fall into those issues sometimes. I mean, the first stories that I ever wrote were about a little girl named Mary, and she went to school, and nothing happened. She just went to school. That's it. But hey, you're learning. Good things to point out. And then finally, he has a wonderful discussion about how verisimilitude, so things seeming like they are in reality, is not truth. So just because someone would speak, a certain way in a conversation, or, how you move your cup around the table, or things like that, like just because it seems like real life does not mean that it's the truth. And you don't have to be realistic, you have to be truthful. And his whole discussion of like, the differences between that was incredibly thought-provoking, and I was incredibly interested. I thought it was great insights. So that chapter, I wrote that it got a 1 from me, but having just talked about it a lot, I mean, I suppose, I'm gonna give it a 1.5, or maybe even a 2. I don't know why I said 1, because it was inspirational. There's like really good points and really interesting conversation. I think I probably gave it a 1 having read like that middle section about the two different ways to be bad, slice of life and overcomplicated. And I was like, yeah, I know not to write a slice of life story. Thank you very much. But I'm changing my rating. I'm giving this chapter a 2. Again, is it gonna completely change how I write my stories? No. Is it that practical? No. But is it very interesting and insightful? Yes. We're moving on to chapter 2. StoryGrid fans, here's your moment. One thing I'm going to mention, if you have never heard of the StoryGrid, StoryGrid was one of my first popular videos on my channel. I have a whole big series about it where I try it. It's by this editor, Sean Coyne. They have a podcast, they have a publishing house, they have a website, there was a book, there's blogs, there's a lot of things there. But basically it's this system of how to evaluate if your story is good or not. And it has kind of expanded beyond then. But anyways, the StoryGrid system is a way to figure out if your story is good or not. And one thing that I will make a separate video about sometime is how I thought that a lot of the stuff in StoryGrid, and he never claimed that he was the originator of it. I thought that Sean Coyne was the originator of it. Turns out that like the best stuff from StoryGrid, minus like the actual methodology, they're in here. And it's funny because I think the first book that you read on something, you assume they're the authority on it. But it's then I read this and I was like, well, this came before Story Grid, so Sean Coyne's obviously read this. And then I was like, well, Robert Mckee has probably read a lot of books too. So who knows where the origin of some of these ideas, like the value shift or progressive complications or best bad choice, irreconcilable goods, where that language came from. Who knows? There's nothing wrong with it, but I thought that was really interesting. All right, chapter 3. It starts off with definitions. So he defines a story event, a story value, scene, act, and beats, etc. Story values, there we go. This is really helpful definition. Story values are the universal qualities of human experience that may shift from positive to negative or negative to positive from one moment to the next. The values is a big thing in this book, just as it is in the Story Grid, and I thought that definition was very helpful. He also defines a beat, which I've never understood what the heck that was. A beat is an exchange of behavior in action-reaction. Beat by beat, these changing behaviors shape the turning of a scene. That didn't clear it up too much for me, the exact definition, but then he does this like lovers breakup scene where he kind of breaks it down and he's like, and then that's a beat, and then that's a beat, and it's very helpful for understanding. I think that's the first time I was ever like, oh, I kind of understand what a beat is. Overall, this chapter is, to be honest, kind of boring, its definitions, but it is really useful. Even if you kind of know what these things are, to have a fresh definition of it is great. The second half of this chapter, though, was about story structure and basically him talking about arch plot versus mini plot versus anti-plot. And quite frankly, I didn't care much about the breakdown of the differences because I write arch plot. I will say that he had some insights I liked. I'm just gonna read my comment here to myself. I really enjoy this breakdown of Hollywood arch plot versus art film mini plot, anti-plot. How Hollywood commercially successful things aren't considered art. We talked about that earlier. We don't like that. So, because Hollywood commercially successful things aren't considered art, young writers want to break convention for the sake of breaking convention. And they often don't believe what most mini-plot, anti-plots show, and what most art films, mostly because they were started right after World War II in that really depressing era of 1984 and The Lord of the Flies and all that stuff, that life is random and meaningless and humans are evil. The funny thing is that most of the people who are trying to write those films now don't actually believe that. And that contradicts most people's point of views, and he's saying that if that's not your experience and that's not your POV, you can't write that story. You shouldn't do it just to do it because it's fancy. And that's a recurring theme in these first few chapters, but I really just appreciated it because I find those discussions very interesting and very validating. Overall, I do give this chapter a 1. It is useful, but it was boring, and then it was stuff I already knew. It's not a bad chapter. This is just my personal rating. It gets better. I know chapter 3 is gonna be great. Chapter 3 is, here we go. Chapter 3 I wrote down, excellent chapter. This chapter is called Structure and Setting. And I would also think of like a subtitle here of how to avoid cliches. So he discusses the 4 dimensions of setting, which are physical, temporal, duration, and something else that I did not write down. And he also talks about the importance of setting to a story and how that sort of importance of setting, a sense of place, if you were, even if it's just like a school environment or a house, and how getting really deep into that and being specific actually helps you avoid cliches and makes the work seem, what's the word? It makes it feel more real and more relatable. It's that specificity breeds relatability or universality. He also talks about research on setting and generally, and I really liked that as well. He talks about the 3 different kinds of research are memory, imagination, and fact. And he really gets down to why you should not go with the first thing that you think of. His big point here is like throw away ideas. 90% of what we write is less than our best. So you should make choices to find that 10% and then burn the rest of it. So if you're trying to solve a problem, he says, brainstorm 5 to 15 ideas. This is also something I learned from Sean Coyne, that the first few things you think of are going to be total cliches. So keep going, keep pushing, keep going deeper. Then Robert Mckee gives a list of questions to ask about the ideas that you've come up with in terms of how to choose one. And so this chapter 3, is rated a 3. It was awesome. I'm 100% going to be using those questions, those elements of setting, and referring back to it all the time. Okay, chapter 4. Chapter 4 is about genre. It is a long, somewhat disorganized, sorry Robert Mckee, list of 25 different genres. So the vocabulary he uses to describe the genres is very helpful. But the reason I call it disorganized, let me just open this, is because it goes everywhere, everything from like comedy, and then we have crime, historical, sports genre, docudrama, mockumentary, animation, art film. That's at the end. This guy really hates art films. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe he doesn't hate art films, but like he's very, I would say, skeptical, healthily skeptical of art films, and I'm here for it. Musical comedy, punitive plot, and it's just that if we think of the story grid, which has the 5 like leaf clover of genre, we would classify things like fantasy and science fiction differently than, say, a crime story, because you can have a fantasy crime story, you can have a mystery science fiction story. And so while these genres I think it's a great list, it's very helpful, I find story grid and the way they take them and arrange them so you can figure out how to do them a little bit more helpful there. It's also, more easily digestible. He also talks about conventions, he chats about the limitations of genres and how they evolve, and then in the conclusion, he tells us to write in the genre that you love. It's all about just being passionate about the story that you're telling, and I love how much that goes through the ethos of this book. Again, it's like story has to be meaningful to you. Story has to have meaning. You have to love what you're writing about. These are great messages, and it's really just a lovely thing to have kind of over and over and over in your head. All right, chapter 5. This is about structure and character. So this also has similarity to the story grid, where he talks about choice escalation. He basically says, character is revealed in the choices a person makes under pressure. Greater pressure, deeper revelation. I really liked that. I liked that point of thinking about your story through the idea and your structure through the idea of what choices is my character being forced to make. He talks about the difficulty of choices and how they show who you are at your heart. We can throw in that Harry Potter quote right here if we want to. We love it. As I said before, Story Grid does talk about the escalation of choices, but this is kind of the chef explanation of choice. It's the why behind why those choices and like the escalation of choices, the series of choices, is so important in a story. He also talks about characterization versus deeper character. He gets into that and how those things are different and how they can contrast. I loved this. Great chapter. It gets a 3 from me. Amazing. Did I rate the last chapter? Genre got a 2. All right, chapter 6 is called Structure and Meaning. And in this chapter, he introduces the concept of a controlling idea as theme. So that's the idea that instead of saying, oh, my theme is love, my theme is justice, you say something to the effect of, my controlling idea is that love happens when blah, 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 blah. He actually defines it as, a controlling idea may be expressed in a single sentence, describing how and why life undergoes change from one condition of existence at the beginning to another at the end. And if you're getting a little like tinkle bells in the back of your head here, that's because this is talking about value. So the value at stake in the story, the values at stake in the story, we're basically saying the control idea is about how you get from like one value to the other. I would have loved more examples in this chapter, but overall, like very helpful and helpful questions to ask yourself too to come to it. He also does a little bit of chatting about propagating between idea and counter idea and how it's important to have like the counter idea to your controlling idea shown in the story. I think that's awesome. There's some great diagrams. The ending is very powerful. I give this chapter a 2 merely because I love examples and I feel like we could have really used more examples of literally like how to create that sentence. I think would have been very helpful. Although, again, great chapter. Chapter 7, here we are. Guys, there's like 18 of these. The substance of story. In chapter 7, he gives some interesting definitions of a protagonist, of their desire, of conscious desire versus unconscious desire, and how the unconscious desire can be self-contradictory. So basically, the substance of story is the fact that your character has a desire, they take some action to get it, they expect a certain thing to happen, and then it doesn't. And that space between I'm gonna do this and get this and what actually happens, he calls the gap, which is when things don't go expected. It's the difference between kind of expectation, where he takes action, and the result, which is the reaction from the world that blocks the character's desire. I thought that was a really interesting way to think of story. Again, really helping you narrow in on what does my character want and what is blocking them. Again, really kind of getting down to those building blocks of like what makes a compelling story. Again, I found that really useful. Continuing on, this entire chapter was awesome. He does this magic if exercise with Chinatown, where he basically takes the screenplay, like puts it on to the page for a scene and imagines what each character's thoughts are in a scene. So I think, what's their girl's name? Evelyn, and then there's the detective. So he'll say like, oh, we know Evelyn is thinking this. And so she says and does X. But then the detective does this opposite thing, and that creates the gap for Evelyn. And then she does something. And like, I'm explaining it terribly. But I found that really, really interesting and a good exercise in terms of how to get into your characters' heads. Not just the protagonist, but every character's heads, because every character is experiencing that kind of gap, and to kind of see how it will ebb and flow, seeing the action, the reaction, just really emphasizing that. Loved it. I also love this quote: "The only reliable source of emotional truth is yourself." Amazing. I give that chapter a 3. This really, really good chapter. Even the magic if exercise, which I described terribly, I thought was like the heart of the book. So, so good. Chapter 8. Yeah, it's called The Inciting Incident, and he basically defines what an inciting incident is. So he says you have the life is off balance, and then comes in an object of desire. So he talks about kind of the world of the story, setting it up, so authorship, so things like, he talks about authenticity. Authenticity isn't actuality. And then he gets to the inciting incident and how that changes the character's life and how the character has to respond to it. There are some really great diagrams kind of showing like the inciting incident and then how the character's desire can be the spine of the story. I have some notes here, like with my character's names next to it. I wrote this on one of the diagrams. I'm like, this is great. Overall, it's a very helpful chapter. He talks about how to design the inciting incident, where to put it, how to make sure it's quality, all of those good things. It's nothing incredibly groundbreaking, so I give it a 2, but it's a good chapter. Chapter 9 is act design. It could also be called progressive complications. He gives us reminders to have actions that escalate in magnitude. He talks about the difference between complexity and complication. He talks about structure. There's a lot of diagrams in this that some of them I didn't really understand, but mostly I did. And he talks about acts and subplots and how they layer over each other. And of course, the reminder that there should be a rhythm here. So some acts will end super low, some will end high, and you should kind of bounce back and forth between that, because you can't just have every act ending bad, 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 or good, 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 good. I give that chapter a 2. Again, useful information, nothing super groundbreaking. Chapter 10 was scene design, and he basically tells us somewhat how to design a scene, but it went off the rails a little bit for me, because there's a lot of discussion about like characters have a scene objective, which is great, and they act with a choice under pressure, and they have to make a choice in there, and there's an unexpected reaction, and there's a setup and a payoff, and it's all kind of stuff that I feel like we already covered in this book, and I think it's really just a setup for the next chapter. He does talk about turning points, which is helpful, and how that, that can change the values of the story. But he also talks about like setups and payoffs and the question of self-expression. I'm just reading the titles, emotional transitions, and how you should go from positive to negative or negative to positive, and how that works. And then there's stuff on the nature of choice, and you shouldn't choose between good and evil or right and wrong. Those are bad choices. That's not interesting. It just felt a little, I guess, I was having a hard time getting like a clear message from this chapter. There was a lot in here that it's just like pieces of things that I think go into a scene, but I didn't think it was like a recipe for this is how you do a great scene, if that makes sense. So like my expectation did not meet with the reality. There was a gap, but I really did love, he does this really great diagram about values and how they change. And I love that diagram. I bookmarked the page. So I'm gonna give that chapter a 1, just because I think it was mostly, this is mean, I'm sure this is not true, but in a way it kind of felt to me like he was like, all right, what haven't I covered before I get to chapter 11? Let's make sure we cover it all. It's better than that, it's way better than that. But just in my memory, like nothing really sticks out besides that, nice value triangle. So it's a 1. Chapter 11 is scene analysis, and this I loved. This chapter was great. So he starts out by having a very interesting conversation on text versus subtext, with some insight into actors that I found very fascinating. And I thought that was one of the best discussions in the book, and a really, really good reminder. And when I think of my own scenes, the ones where it's very clear what the subtext is those are my favorite scenes that I've ever written. And it's a reminder to make sure there's always that subtext happening. He then goes through the technique of scene analysis, and this part is step by step. He does 2 worked examples. I love examples. If this was a book of all examples, I'd be down. Examples are my favorite thing. So he does an analysis of Casablanca, a scene in that, and then Through a Glass Darkly. Through a Glass Darkly sounds like a very scary movie, but the Casablanca analysis I absolutely loved. He really goes into talking about what the subtext is, talking about what the beats are, and helping you analyze how the values of the story move and change from beat to beat. I wrote down finally understand what a beat is, because this chapter really drove it home to me. It gets a 3 out of 3, amazing chapter. The next chapter is chapter 12, and it's on composition, and it is about the linking and ordering of scenes. He talks about pacing, rhythm, tempo, rhythm being like the length of the scene, tempo being the level of activity and action and dialogue, and he also talks about progression, and how you can raise the stakes. I think there's like 3 different methods or ways through which you can raise the stakes. He talks about them. It was interesting for sure. I give it a 1 just because it wasn't new information for me personally. But again, like, none of these chapters are bad. They all have good insights and good reminders in them. This is like anyways, we're moving on. Chapter 13, crisis, climax, and resolution. In this, we talked about the crisis, climax, and resolution. Who knew? It's really, really useful definitions and examples. He talks about how to design and where to place the crisis, and the examples of that were very interesting to me because sometimes the crisis is at the very beginning of the movie, like in James Bond, he says, and sometimes the crisis is like in the last couple of minutes, or in Casablanca, the crisis comes like at the end of Act 2, whereas in a lot of stories, it comes in Act 3, and he's kind of talking about how this can move around. And I think that's a really great discussion that a lot of books, such as Save the Cat, and I love Save the Cat, they say, you know, the final crisis, the final decision happens at XX percentage. And that like ending act, and I think people who've written Save the Cat would say the same, is the one that holds up the least depending on the different stories. Like the order of crisis, climax, and where things fall in, it really changes story to story. So I loved this discussion of where to put the crisis. I also loved the discussion on the fact that the crisis should be deliberately static, and we need to delay things and show the character actually deliberating the crisis. And that was like a in my mind, being like, oh my goodness, yes, that makes total sense. And as I was reading back my novel earlier today, I was like, I need to show her deliberating here. Like, it's not a clear crisis moment. In some scenes, I don't think you have to show deliberation, but in the big ones, absolutely. We need to see what the character is thinking. Loved that. And then he talks about resolutions. He talks about climaxes first. There's discussions and examples of a good climax and how they are inevitable but also unexpected, and how a climax is when the value does like a max charge swing for the story. Really interesting stuff in there. And then he talks about these 3 uses for a resolution, which I'd never heard before and I thought were interesting. One is the climax of a subplot. So you resolve, like you have the climax and then you use the resolution to resolve a subplot. 2, you show the spread of climactic effects. And 3, it's a literal courtesy. You can't just have the climax and then leave. Sometimes story vocabulary really makes me laugh because that would be a good joke. I don't know how to make it, but that would be a good joke. All right. And then we get into the final section of the book. I've been sort of ignoring the sections. Apologies for that. But this is the section, part 4, called The Writer at Work. And here he talks about things that are a little bit more practical and how-to-y. And I really enjoy the quote here. I wrote, say Ernest Hemingway quote in my notebook. And the Ernest Hemingway quote is, the first draft of anything is shit. We love that. Great quote. All right, chapter 14, principles of antagonism. And I have a whole page dedicated to this chapter. Holy macaroni. All right. He says, the protagonist is only as emotionally compelling and interesting as the forces of antagonism make them. That's a really good point. I fall into this. A lot of writers fall into this trap where we focus so much on our hero and we forget about the antagonist, and they're actually just as important, if not, we should think of them as more important because we never pay attention to them in a story. I really enjoyed his explanation for this, which is basically that like we never do anything unless we have to, and so you have to make sure that there's a negative part of the story that is like pushing the character to change, because unless they have to, like nobody's gonna change. You know how you're like walking around and you're like, oh yeah, I should wake up like 30 minutes earlier so I can do yoga, and you have like your whole day where you could do yoga and you're just not finding the time. Then suddenly you have like a meeting at 7 a.m. every morning and you're like, oh my God, I have no time to work out. Then you wake up half an hour earlier. I don't know if that really metaphor simile thing made sense, but that's what we're going with, and it was a good point. Forces of antagonism equals anything that opposes the hero's desire. Love it. And he says that we should take the story to the end of the line, which is the negation of the negation. And this chapter was really great. Sean Coyne also talks about the negation of the negation. And I love it anytime we get into these values, because originally, I'm going to be honest, I just read this book like a month ago. But I've known about the story grid for a long time, and they also talk about the negation of the negation and the story values, and I never really got it until I was editing the third draft of a novel, which I'm doing right now, and I read story, and I was like, yep, these, they were right. I need this. So there's that. Anyways, he does these really fun diagrams. I don't know if you can see. These are my copies of his diagrams where he's showing all of the different values. And he gives you kind of like a value, four corner of opposition values, which is cool. So there's the positive value, the contrary value, the contradictory value, and the negation of the negation. So for example, a positive value is success. The contradiction is failure. The contrary, in the middle, is compromise. And the negation of the negation is selling out. And the negation of the negation, he says, is supposed to be like the limit of human experience. He does the same thing, like he does this for like a dozen different values. And one I really liked as well was bravery. So bravery is positive, cowardice is the opposite. Fear is the contrary, and then the negation of the negation is cowardice perceived as courage. All of these values listed out were very, very, very helpful to me. I really, really appreciated it. It made me understand values a lot more than I had before and have an idea on that. Like there's not like 3 or 4 fixed values that every story has to turn on, that it can turn on all of these different ones and look at them. Really loved that. Very useful chapter. There's questions at the end to ask of your own story. I thought those were great. 3 out of 3. Thank you, Principles of Antagonism. You've been a great chapter. Oh my God. We have 4 more. We have 4 more. We can do it. There's so many. This is a long video. There are so many chapters. This is a very long book. I don't know if you... It took me a while to read. I'm a fast reader, but like... Okay. Chapter 15 is about exposition. And there were 3 main takeaways I got from this chapter. Number 1, pace the exposition. So the most critical piece of exposition is last, which makes it powerful. This is related to the story grid saying of use exposition as ammunition. I think it's a great point. Love it. Number 2, if you need to give exposition, get the audience to ask why. I thought that was a really, really good insight because, you have to create the question in the audience and then give them the answer. I think some of these things like the sequence of choices for the hero, what question is the audience asking at what times, what questions are the characters asking at what times. I think that is a really good way to track a story beyond just beats. Beats are super helpful, don't get me wrong. But looking at like your revelation sequence, your choice sequence, your audience question sequence, I think those are really, really good ways to think of stories and to help just help yourself write it. And then number 3 was dramatic exposition. So use exposition to create turning points in the story. He also covers discussion of backstory, like flashbacks, montages, voiceovers. He's not a fan of voiceovers. It's good stuff. I give it a 2. It's very, very helpful. Not life-changing. It is not chapter 14. Chapter 14 was amazing, but it is quite good. Chapter 16. Chapter 16 is called Problems and Solutions, and he addresses 8 fairly sprawling problems. And if that was the one flaw I could give to this book, is that like the organization of it, I'm sure makes total sense to him. It just doesn't fit well with my brain. Like, for example, he talks about how to develop interest in a story all the way to like how to adapt a story from a book into a movie. And in my mind, like the problem of capturing audience interest is so different than the problem of how to adapt a story from a book into a movie. That like, I get why it's there, like functionally, but just my brain, it just doesn't, there's nothing wrong with it. It just doesn't, it's not flowing well for me. But he talks about these interesting questions and these interesting problems that lots of writers have. The first one being how to create interest in a story. And I loved the answer to this. This was great. He talks about the concept of the center of good and how we create empathy by showing the audience where that center of the good is. Reminder, he points out that like good could be like the Corleones in The Godfather, where they're like mobsters and murderers and nobody's good and it's all kind of evil. But the center of the good is the Corleones because they're loyal. And if you show the audience where your center of good is, they will root for it. Rah-rah. The other questions he covers are the difference between mystery, suspense, and dramatic irony. Classic. People always forget that, so that's good to have. He talks about how to create surprises. He talks about coincidences, comedy, point of view, adaptation, melodrama, and then finally holes, like plot holes. And he defines a plot hole as a missing link in the cause and effect chain that lacks logic. And I thought that was a very good definition. Chapter 17 is about character. This is where he talks about dimensions of character and how elements of your character should be hidden, and that the cast brings out different sides of each other. So like when you're with your mom, you're a different person than you are with your boyfriend or whatever, and you'll see different aspects of their character that the cast brings out in each other. I thought that was a really good reminder. There is a great diagram. I'm not gonna go looking for it and show it to you, but basically it shows how like a character can be at the center and how different values and personality traits can come out, and they have like these surrounding characters around the outside, and it's a really interesting diagram. And when you're writing a book like I am with a larger ensemble cast, it's very thought-provoking to me, honestly, of thinking through, okay, how do I show how these people are different when they're with different members of their group? It's a really interesting question. So there's a couple of additional tips there as well for writing characters in film. Overall, I give that chapter a 3, even though, and this is the point that's confusing to me, I understand why he did this, but I'm used to having like everything about character in one chapter. He does the character and structure, and then later on talks about character. And I think it's totally fine, and the organization can make sense. I think the only issue I have with it is that if I have a question about character, I'm like, oh, when does he talk about characterization versus deep character? Oh, it must be in chapter 17, which is literally called character. But it's not. It's in like chapter 5. And so it's really, I found it difficult to go back and remember what was where and where to look. Like there's no index. So it's kind of hard to look back on things. And it's a very big book. I keep saying this is 420 pages, which is also a great number of pages. Oh my goodness. Woo. I'm not gonna look through this book to find the stuff that I want, you know what I mean? So sometimes I think organization is not just for like the presentation of information, which works great, but more for like, can I reference this reference book? And it's difficult. And this might only be a problem for me because I've been writing a review on it, and I'm lazy and I didn't want to read the book twice and like go through and find the pages, and I was like, why isn't there a better way to find this information? Whatever. We're gonna stop talking about that and move on to chapter 18. Did I mention chapter 17 was a 3? Chapter 17 was a 3. It was great. Chapter 18 is about the text. He talks about dialogue, description, image systems, titles. Honestly, it was all very filmy. It's probably the most filmy chapter of all of the chapters, so it was a 1 for me, but it would probably be like a 2 or a 3 for someone who's actually a screenwriter, so take that with an absolute grain of salt. And then chapter 19, he calls the writer's method, and this is your step-by-step where he says, you know, first you create an outline, and then a treatment, and then a script. Again, that was a 1 for me just because it was super screenwriting, and that's, you know, not relevant. But that's only 2 out of 19 chapters, plus an introduction and epilogue. That was not relevant to me. So like, I got a lot of bang for my buck. So overall, this book was really, really good. I got a lot of 3s in there, a lot of 2s, a lot of chapters that are really helpful and tools that I want to continue using. I do wish there was a summary. And also the weird story at the end is like a little much for, like a little much for me, but that's fine. It's just not my taste. Everybody else, there are people who I'm sure love it and find it very inspirational. I was like, why are we talking about a bug? But that's fine. But that's my one flaw of this book. It would be great to have something that refreshes your memory. The last sentence says, keep this book close at hand until you have command of its principles. This book has 420 pages with no index. So like, I don't know. Could you have maybe had a list of the principles just to like, I don't know, restart my memory in the back? Some of us are lazy and we don't want to look at it, but that's my only critique of the book. Literally, I really, really enjoyed this. And I think I got a lot out of it. And what I've said here, like I'm literally just listing topics and giving like a couple of quotes and definitions. There is so much jam-packed into this. I probably will read it again at some point, even though, you know, it took me a minute, just because it's like so dense with good information, a lot like Anatomy of Story. So let me know, have you read Robert Mckee's story. Have you read this book? Did you like it? What do you think? Did you have a chapter or a concept or a quote that stood out to you? If you haven't read this, what is your favorite craft book? And what sort of insights did you take from it that made it your favorite? I can't wait to hear about it. Make sure you chat in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Also, please recommend what craft book you think I should review next. I am working my way through John Truby's Anatomy of Genre right now, and I'm absolutely loving it. I can't wait to review that one as well.